Did the most powerful woman in the Roman Empire actually sneak out of the palace for a night of scandalous adventure? It sounds like fiction, a lurid fantasy. Yet, this is the story that has defined Empress Messalina for 2,000 years. The story of her life is one of history's most scandalous and most enduring tales. But was she truly the figure ancient historians described? A woman of insatiable appetites that threatened the stability of the Roman state? Or was she something else entirely? Could she have been the victim of the most brilliant and most ruthless smear campaign of the ancient world? Tonight, we will journey back to the heart of imperial Rome. We will walk the marble halls of the Palatine Hill, a world of absolute power, deadly conspiracies, and reputations as fragile as glass. Together, we will sift through the surviving accounts, written by men who were her political enemies. We will look past the smoke and mirrors of ancient propaganda to find the real woman hidden behind the legend. If you enjoy untangling the complex mysteries of the past, consider liking this video and subscribing for more deep dives into history. And let us know in the comments which historical figure's reputation you think is the most unfair. Welcome to Sleeping Scribe. Here, we believe that history is not just a collection of dates and facts, but a tapestry of human stories. Calming stories that can help you unwind, relax, and gently fall asleep. Tonight on Bedtime History, we delve into the extraordinary tale of the Empress who became a prostitute for one night. Our story begins not with Messalina herself, but with the dangerous and paranoid world she was born into. It was a world where emperors were gods, and their family members were targets. A world built on a foundation of shimmering marble, and cemented with blood and fear. The Julio-Claudian dynasty was Rome's first. A grand experiment born from a century of civil war. It began with the brilliant Augustus, who skillfully disguised a monarchy as a restored republic. He ruled for over 4 decades, bringing peace and stability. But this peace was a fragile thing. It was maintained by a delicate balance of political theater, military might, and the creation of a new, terrifying force. An elite unit of soldiers known as the Praetorian Guard. Their stated purpose was simple. They were to be the emperor's personal bodyguards. But in a city where power flowed from the tip of a sword, they quickly became something more. They became kingmakers. Their loyalty or their betrayal could determine the fate of an empire. Augustus had created a sword to protect himself and hung it directly over the heads of all who would follow him. When Augustus died, the throne passed to his stepson, Tiberius. And with Tiberius, the paranoia that festered just beneath the surface of the new order began to seep out. The early promise of his reign slowly curdled into suspicion and dread. This process accelerated dramatically in the year 26 A.D. Tiberius, growing weary of the politics of Rome and haunted by personal tragedies, retreated. He left the sprawling, chaotic city for the idyllic island of Capri. There, he lived in seclusion, surrounded by luxury and his own dark thoughts. He left behind a vacuum of power. And into that vacuum stepped a man named Sejanus. Lucius Aelius Sejanus was the prefect of the Praetorian Guard. With the emperor absent, he became the de facto ruler of Rome, and he unleashed a reign of terror. The city held its breath. The corridors of the Palatine Hill, once filled with the confident bustle of a global capital, grew quiet. Now, there were only hushed, fearful whispers. Senators would greet each other with practiced smiles, all the while wondering if the man they spoke to was an informant. Every conversation was a potential trap. Sejanus perfected the use of a particularly insidious weapon, the treason trial. In the Old Republic, the charge of *majestis populi Romani, imminuta diminishing the majesty of the Roman people, was used for acts like desertion or insurrection. But now it was twisted and expanded. Under Tiberius and Sejanus, treason could mean anything. A poorly chosen joke, a forgotten birthday wish for the emperor, a dream interpreted as disrespectful. Slander against the emperor, real or imagined, became a capital offense. This was not about justice. It was about power. It became the perfect tool to eliminate political rivals, to seize their fortunes, and to ensure that no one dared to challenge the new order. A hasty accusation could be inscribed on a wax tablet, the stylus pressing into the soft, dark surface, sealing a man's fate before he even knew he was in danger. Banquets in the great houses became tense affairs. The taste of watered-down wine would turn to ash in a guest's mouth, as every word spoken was weighed, measured, and stored away for future use. The terror of Sejanus eventually consumed him, as Tiberius, alerted to his prefect's ambition, had him executed. But the poison had already seeped deep into the bones of the empire. The culture of fear remained, and it would be perfected by Tiberius's successor, his great-nephew Gaius, better known to history by his childhood nickname, Caligula. Caligula's reign began in 37 AD, and it descended into a nightmare of imperial madness. He was erratic, cruel, and possessed a theatrical flair for tyranny. He squandered the vast treasury left by Tiberius on lavish projects and decadent games. But his extravagance was matched only by his cruelty. Prominent senators and even his own family members were executed on the flimsiest of pretexts, their property confiscated to fund his whims. He blurred the line between ruler and god in a way that shocked the Roman aristocracy. He demanded to be worshipped as a living deity, Neos Helios, the new sun. Statues of gods in the temples had their heads removed and replaced with his own. One can imagine a Roman noble walking through a familiar temple, the air thick with the scent of expensive incense, only to look up and see the emperor's face staring back with the cold, dead eyes of a Jupiter or an Apollo. The familiar comfort of religion was gone, replaced by the unsettling presence of a mortal man who believed himself divine. This was more than just arrogance. It was a fundamental break with Roman tradition, and it bred a unique kind of fear, mingled with a disbelieving contempt. Perhaps nothing captures the absurdity and menace of his rule better than the story of his horse, Incitatus. The ancient historians tell us that Caligula so cherished his steed that he gave him a marble stall, a jeweled collar, and a household of slaves. He would invite the horse to dinner, serving it oats mixed with gold flakes. And then came the ultimate insult to the Roman political system. He declared his intention to make Incitatus a consul, the highest office in the Republic. Whether he was serious or not is still debated, but the message was clear. His horse was more worthy of honor than the entire Roman Senate. The senators had to sit there in the great Senate house, the smell of incense failing to mask the metallic scent of their own fear, and pretend to take this proclamation seriously. To be a member of the imperial family during this time was to live with a death sentence hanging over your head. This was the Domus Augusta, the imperial household, the center of all power, and it was a nest of vipers. Power was not just wielded by the emperor, but by those closest to him. His wives, his mother, his sisters held immense informal influence. They could shape policy, make or break careers, and condemn men to death with a whisper. The precedent had been set by Livia, the formidable wife of Augustus. The historian Tacitus paints her as a sinister, controlling figure, a master of intrigue who ruthlessly cleared the path for her own son, Tiberius. By the time Caligula was on the throne, the family had already devoured many of its own. Potential heirs to Augustus, his grandsons and relatives, had died one by one, often under mysterious circumstances. Poison was a constant fear. A sudden illness was never just an illness. The aristocracy learned a brutal lesson. Survival depended on ruthlessness, on careful concealment of one's thoughts, and on the forging of strategic alliances. Power was everything. And for those who fell from it, the consequences were absolute. The Romans had a concept for this: damnatio memoria, the damnation of memory. When an enemy of the state was defeated, the Senate could vote to erase them from history. Their names would be chiseled off public inscriptions. Their statues would be torn down, the cold marble heads severed from their bodies and tossed into the Tiber River. Their laws would be rescinded, their memory cursed. It was a chillingly thorough form of annihilation. To not only kill a man, but to attempt to unmake his entire existence. This was the world that awaited anyone who made a mistake. A world of glinting Praetorian helmets on every corner, a constant reminder of where true power lay. It was a world of paranoia, where the safest path was to be utterly, completely, and totally overlooked. Into this dangerous world, a girl with impeccable connections was born. Her lineage was a direct link to the divine Augustus. And in the Julio-Claudian dynasty, this was both a shield and a target. Her name was Valeria Messalina. Valeria Messalina was born around the year 20 AD, during the reign of Tiberius. She was born into the absolute heart of the Roman aristocracy. Her blood was a cocktail of the most powerful families in the empire. Her father was Marcus Valerius Messala Barbatus, a man from a distinguished consular family. Sadly, he would die when Messalina was just a young child, leaving her to be raised in a household of powerful women. Her mother was Domitia Lepida the Younger, a woman of staggering connections. Domitia Lepida was the great-niece of the first emperor, Augustus himself. This single fact placed Messalina in the innermost circle of the imperial clan. Let's untangle this prestigious and dangerous family tree. Messalina's maternal grandmother was Antonia the Elder. Antonia the Elder's mother was Octavia the Younger. And Octavia was the beloved elder sister of Augustus. This meant that Messalina was the great-grandniece of the man who founded the Roman Empire. The blood of the Iuli and the Claudi flowed through her veins. This also made her a direct cousin to the sitting emperor, Caligula. For a young girl growing up in this treacherous court, such a lineage was an immense asset, a source of status and wealth. But it also made her an object of intense political calculation. She was a valuable political pawn, and her future marriage would not be a matter of personal affection, but of dynastic strategy. As a young Roman noblewoman, a Nobilis, her life would have followed a strict and predictable path. Her world would have been the domus, the sprawling family home in Rome, an oasis of private luxury in a bustling city. Her education would not have been in military strategy or public oratory, the domains of men. Instead, it would have focused entirely on preparing her to be a matrona, a virtuous and dignified Roman wife. She would have learned to manage the complex logistics of a large household, overseeing dozens, perhaps hundreds, of slaves. She would have been taught the art of weaving, a symbolic activity that represented Roman female virtue. She would have sat for hours with tutors, likely Greek slaves, who would recite poetry and philosophy. She would read the epic tales of dutiful Roman women from history, women like Cornelia, mother of the Gracchi, who pointed to her sons and declared, "These are my jewels." The lessons were clear. A woman's glory came from the success of her husband and the virtue of her children. Her home would have been a monument to her family's greatness. In the atrium, the main public hall, she would walk every day past the portrait busts of her ancestors. The stern marble faces of generations of consuls and generals would stare down at her, a constant reminder of the legacy she was expected to uphold. The floors beneath her feet would be covered in intricate mosaics, depicting scenes from mythology, the triumphs of heroes, the whims of the gods. These were not just decorations. They were lessons in power, fate, and ambition. In the family library, the air would be thick with the unique smell of wax from writing tablets and the dry, earthy scent of papyrus scrolls, filled with history and literature. But beyond the protected walls of her home, the world was a terrifying place. She was a child during the height of Sejanus's power and the subsequent purges. She would have been old enough to understand the whispers, the sudden disappearances of family friends. She would have witnessed the downfall of other powerful women. Women like Agrippina the Elder, the proud and defiant granddaughter of Augustus, were a cautionary tale. Agrippina was the widow of the beloved hero Germanicus, as she openly defied Emperor Tiberius. For her defiance, she was arrested, publicly flogged, and eventually exiled to a barren island where she starved to death. Her sons were hunted down and killed. The lesson for a young Messalina would have been brutally clear. A woman's power was conditional. Defiance leads to ruin. Survival required quiet compliance and careful maneuvering. As she grew into a teenager, she would have started to wear the stola, the traditional garment of a married Roman woman, a symbol of her status and her modesty. It was a heavy, restrictive garment designed to conceal the form. It must have felt formal and confining, a constant physical reminder of the rigid expectations placed upon her. She would have been adorned with the signs of her family's wealth, the feel of fine imported silk against her skin, the weight of heavy gold jewelry on her arms and neck. But these luxuries were also chains, binding her to her destiny as a piece in a larger political game. Her entire value, her wealth, her status, her very life was tied to her family's name and her future ability to produce a male heir for a powerful husband. We have no reliable sources that tell us anything about her personality as a child. Roman historians were not interested in the inner lives of young girls. Her story, as it has been passed down to us, is written almost entirely from the moment of her marriage to Claudius. The canvas of her youth is blank, allowing her later enemies to paint any picture they wished upon it. But we can surmise that she was a product of her environment, an environment that taught her that power was paramount, that men were dangerous and unpredictable, and that a woman's best weapon was her bloodline and her strategic value. Her very existence, as a direct descendant of Augustus's own sister, was a political statement in a family that was systematically devouring itself. For a young woman of such high birth, marriage was not a matter of love, but of political strategy. Her family, likely under the direction of Emperor Caligula himself, sought a husband for her. They needed a match that would honor her lineage, but not create a new power couple that could challenge the emperor. And so, their eyes fell upon a man who seemed, to everyone in Rome, like the safest, most harmless, and least ambitious man in the entire imperial family. A man who was, in fact, Messalina's own great-uncle. His name was Tiberius Claudius Nero Germanicus. He was the Forgotten Prince, born in 10 BC in the city of Lugdunum in Gaul, modern-day Lyon, France. Claudius was the perennial outsider in his own family. He was the son of the brilliant and beloved general Nero Claudius Drusus and the noble Antonia the Younger, making him the nephew of Emperor Tiberius and the brother of the heroic Germanicus. His pedigree was impeccable, but from birth, Claudius was a disappointment. He was afflicted with a host of physical ailments that embarrassed his image-conscious family. Ancient sources, particularly the historian Suetonius, describe his condition in detail. He had a weak knee and an ungainly limp. His head trembled. He stammered when he spoke, and when excited, he would drool. Modern diagnoses have ranged from cerebral palsy to Tourette's syndrome, but to the Romans, who prized physical perfection, he was simply defective, an object of mockery and shame. His own mother, Antonia, a woman praised for her virtue, was reportedly merciless. Suetonius claims she called him a monstrosity of a human being, one that nature began and never finished. Whenever she wanted to call someone a fool, she would say, "He is a bigger fool than my Claudius." The first emperor, Augustus, and his powerful wife, Livia, saw him as a profound embarrassment to the imperial house. They systematically excluded him from public life. He was denied the political and military career that was the birthright of a man of his station. While his peers were governing provinces and leading legions, Claudius was kept hidden away. He became a ghost in his own palace, and so he retreated. He found his refuge not in the political arena or on the battlefield, but in the quiet solitude of the library. The air in his chambers would have been thick with the scent of old scrolls and dusty papyrus. He became a dedicated and apparently quite talented scholar. He was a historian. He wrote multi-volume works on the history of the Etruscans and the Carthaginians, two of Rome's ancient rivals. He even developed new letters for the Latin alphabet to better represent their sounds. His works are now lost, a casualty of time, but they paint a picture of a man with a keen intellect, a man who found more comfort in the distant past than in the terrifying present. One can picture him, a large, shambling figure, his awkward gait echoing on the polished marble floors of the palace. As he walked, he would hear the stifled laughter of courtiers, the cruel whispers behind cupped hands. At lavish imperial banquets, he would be the one seated at the far end of the table, a forgotten figure, feeling utterly ignored while others schemed and flattered. While they engaged in the deadly dance of politics, he would be lost in his thoughts, poring over historical texts, his large hands carefully handling the heavy, precious tomes. His reputation as a harmless, bumbling academic became his defining feature. No one, absolutely no one, perceived him as a threat. And in the reigns of Tiberius and Caligula, this was his greatest political asset. It was the shield that allowed him to survive while his more impressive relatives were executed or forced into suicide. He was the family fool, and the fool was safe. When his nephew Caligula became emperor, his life became a spectacle of public humiliation. Caligula, with his characteristic cruelty, appointed Claudius as his co-consul, only to mock him relentlessly. He would pelt him with olive bits at dinner. He would encourage other guests to laugh at his stammer. He forced him into near bankruptcy by making him pay exorbitant fees. Yet still, Claudius endured. He played the part he had been assigned his entire life. He had been married twice before. His first marriage, to Plausia Urgulanilla, ended in divorce on the grounds of her suspected adultery and involvement in a murder plot. His second, to Aelia Paetina, also ended in divorce. By the time Caligula was looking for a husband for his young cousin Messalina, Claudius was approaching 50 years of age. He was an aging, awkward scholar with a reputation for being a laughingstock. Around the year 38 I.D.V. the emperor arranged the marriage. The vibrant, beautiful teenage noblewoman, a direct descendant of Augustus's sister, was wed to the clumsy 50-year-old forgotten prince. It must have been a bizarre pairing. To the Roman court, it likely seemed like another one of Caligula's cruel jokes. The marriage was probably intended to further anchor Claudius to the Julian line through Messalina's blood, while simultaneously tying him to a young, supposedly controllable wife who could be easily watched. It was a political footnote, a minor alliance between two marginal figures in the imperial family. No one could have predicted that this union of the girl from a great house and the forgotten prince would soon be at the very center of the Roman world. A bloody event, brewing in the shadows of the palace, was about to change everything. The end for Caligula came suddenly and violently. His tyranny had become unbearable. His mockery of the Senate was relentless, and his erratic demands on the military had alienated the very men who were sworn to protect him. A conspiracy took root within the Praetorian Guard itself, led by an officer named Cassius Chaerea, a man whom Caligula had personally and repeatedly insulted. On January 24th, in the year 41, they struck. The day was filled with the noise and excitement of the Palatine Games. As the emperor was walking through a secluded passage, a cryptoporticus, on his way to lunch, the assassins cornered him. The first blow was struck by Chaerea. Then the others descended. The sound of their swords clashing against bone and flesh would have echoed off the stone walls. The sudden, shocking screams died down just as quickly. Caligula, the living god, lay dead on the floor, his blood staining the pristine marble. The chaos was immediate. The assassins were not content with killing just the emperor. They stormed through the palace, hunting for his family. They found his wife, Milonia Caesonia, and their infant daughter, Julia Drusilla. They were murdered without mercy. The entire line of Caligula was to be extinguished. As news of the assassination spread, the city was thrown into confusion. The German bodyguard of the emperor went on a rampage, killing several innocent bystanders out of blind loyalty. Meanwhile, the Senate, sensing an opportunity, convened. They began to seriously debate the possibility of abolishing the Principate altogether and restoring the old Roman Republic. For a few frantic hours, it seemed as if the Julio-Claudian dynasty had died with Caligula. But the senators had forgotten about the Praetorian Guard. The Guard had no place in a restored republic. Their power, their prestige, and their inflated pay all depended on the existence of an emperor. And so, while the senators debated, the soldiers acted. They began to ransack the palace, looking for loot and any remaining loyalists to Caligula. And here, history records one of its most famous and dramatic scenes. According to the historian Suetonius, a common soldier, a Praetorian named Gratus, was exploring a darkened room. He noticed a pair of feet peeking out from beneath a long curtain that hung against the wall. Curious, he pulled the heavy fabric aside. Cowering there, trembling with fear, was the 50-year-old Claudius. He had been in the palace when the assassination occurred and had hidden at the first sound of violence, certain that he would be next. Seeing the armed soldier, Claudius fell to his knees and begged for his life. But Gratus did not raise his sword. In that moment of terror and confusion, the soldier had an idea. He looked at this pathetic, trembling man, the brother of Germanicus, the nephew of Tiberius, the last adult male of the imperial family. He was not a threat. He was a symbol. Gratus and his fellow soldiers did not need a brilliant leader. They needed a justification for their own power. They needed an emperor. Instead of killing Claudius, Gratus hailed him. The other soldiers, crowding into the room, smelling of sweat, leather, and blood, took up the cry. "Hail, Caesar!" they roared. The deafening sound must have terrified the already petrified Claudius. They lifted the awkward scholar onto their shoulders and carried him out of the palace. They paraded him through the streets to the safety of the Praetorian camp. The Senate's debate about the Republic came to an abrupt halt. They had the fine words and the noble ideals. But the Praetorians had the swords, and now they had an emperor. Claudius, quickly grasping the situation, sealed the deal. He promised every single soldier in the Praetorian Guard a massive sum of 15,000 sesterces. It was a fortune. He became the first Roman emperor to explicitly buy the loyalty of the army. It was a dangerous precedent, but a necessary one. Powerless, the Senate reluctantly confirmed the choice of the soldiers. The forgotten prince was now the master of the Roman world. And in that instant, everything changed for his young wife. Valeria Messalina, barely 21 years old, was suddenly the empress. She was the most powerful woman in the most powerful empire on earth. She had already given Claudius a daughter, named Claudia Octavia. And shortly after his ascension, she would give birth to a son, Britannicus, securing the succession and solidifying her own position. She was granted the title of Augusta, a name of immense prestige, a title once held by the legendary Livia. One can only imagine the cold, heavy feeling of the imperial signet ring being placed on Claudius's finger, an act that transformed her life forever. A teenage girl had become an empress overnight. She now possessed power beyond imagination. But in Rome, power was a poison as much as a prize. It was a dangerous, unstable force that had destroyed everyone who had held it improperly. Messalina, young and inexperienced, would have to learn to wield it, and wield it quickly if she wanted to survive. A teenage girl had become an empress overnight. She now possessed power beyond imagination. But in Rome, power was a poison as much as a prize, and Messalina would have to learn to wield it quickly to survive. The trembling girl found hiding behind a curtain was gone. In her place, an empress was rising, one who understood that in this dynasty of vipers, hesitation was a death sentence. In the chaotic aftermath of Caligula's assassination, Messalina stepped into the blinding light of imperial authority. Her new title, Augusta, was more than just a name. It was a mantle of immense prestige, a declaration of her supreme status. And with the title came the honors. Across the vast Roman Empire, from the misty shores of Britain to the hot sands of Egypt, her image began to proliferate. Statues were erected in her honor, her likeness carved from pristine marble, presenting a serene and dignified face to the world. And for the first time, she would have held in her hand a cool, heavy silver denarius, and seen her own portrait minted on its surface, forever linked with that of her husband, the emperor. Her face was now currency, a tangible symbol of her power that would pass through the hands of millions of her subjects. In the temples, public prayers were now offered not just for the well-being of Claudius, but for Messalina and her children as well. She had become a part of the state religion, a pillar of the new regime. Her primary, official role was the one expected of any Roman matrona, yet for her, it carried the weight of the world. She had to produce heirs. This was the sacred duty upon which the stability of the entire empire rested. She had already proven her worth with the birth of a daughter, Claudia Octavia, a year or two earlier. But the new dynasty needed a son. And in a moment of timing that must have seemed like a divine omen, she delivered. Just 20 days into Claudius's reign, in the imperial palace, still reeling from the recent bloodshed, the sound of an infant's cry echoed through the halls. It was the cry of her newborn son, Britannicus. The birth was a political event of the highest magnitude. It solidified her husband's fragile grasp on the throne and secured her own position as the mother of the heir. A wave of relief must have washed over the court. The succession was no longer a question mark. It now had a name and a future. With her formal duties so spectacularly fulfilled, Messalina began to wield the real informal power of an empress. The imperial palace was the nucleus of all power, and she was at its very center. Unofficially, she became the master of patronage. The Roman Empire was run by a vast network of governors, administrators, and military commanders. Ambitious men from the senatorial class knew that the surest path to a desirable post was not through merit alone, but through influence. And the empress had influence in spades. She controlled access to the emperor himself. We can picture the scene. The antechambers of the palace, filled with powerful men in their fine togas, all waiting for a precious few moments with the emperor. And it was Messalina who often decided who would be granted an audience and who would be turned away with a polite excuse. She was the gatekeeper. To be in her favor was to have the ear of the emperor. To be her enemy was to be shut out from the halls of power completely. Petitioners would flock to her, perhaps catching at the hem of her stola as she passed, their hands reaching out, their voices pleading for her to champion their cause. The ancient historians, all men from the senatorial class that she so often bypassed, were united in their explanation for her influence. They claimed that the aging Claudius, who had been mocked and overlooked his entire life, was utterly and completely infatuated with his beautiful young wife. The historian Suetonius described him as being excessively fond of her, or uxorious. He was, in their telling, putty in her hands, a man so besotted that he would grant her any request, no matter how outrageous. This portrayal served a dual purpose for her enemies. It depicted Claudius as a weak, submissive fool, and it framed Messalina as a manipulative woman who used her feminine charms to seize unnatural power. Whether driven by infatuation or by a shrewd political partnership, Claudius showered her with honors that were unprecedented for an empress. At the theater, she was granted the right to sit in the front seats alongside the Vestal virgins. This was a shocking honor. The Vestals were sacred, their purity a cornerstone of Roman religion. To place Messalina among them was to elevate her to a similar pedestal of virtue and untouchability, a public statement of her supreme dignity. He also granted her a special legal privilege known as the Jus Trium Liberorum, the rights of a mother of 3 children. This law granted legal independence to Roman women who had produced at least 3 heirs, freeing them from the lifelong legal control of a male guardian. Claudius granted it to Messalina, even though she only had 2 children. With a stroke of the pen, she was made one of the most legally autonomous women in Rome. Her birthday became a publicly celebrated holiday, another honor that blurred the line between mortal empress and revered public figure. She did not wield this power in a vacuum. She understood that to protect her own position, and more importantly, the future of her son Britannicus, she needed allies. The imperial court was a dangerous place, filled with rival factions and ambitious families. She began to form a political bloc, a tight-knit circle of trust at the heart of the administration. They would meet in the secluded gardens of the palace, the air thick with the scent of roses and jasmine, and there strategic whispers would be shared. Alliances would be forged, and the fates of powerful men decided. This was not just personal ambition. It was a calculated strategy for survival. But this very public and very active political role was viewed with deep suspicion and resentment by the traditional Roman elite. The proper place for a woman, even an empress, was in the domus, the home. She was supposed to be a quiet symbol of virtue, not an active player in the political arena. Messalina's visible power, her control over patronage, her public honors, it was all seen as a grotesque subversion of the proper order of things. She was a woman doing a man's job, and for the proud senators who traced their lineage back to the founding of the Republic, this was an unforgivable transgression. Her power was real, but it was built on a foundation of resentment that was growing deeper by the day. But Messalina could not rule alone. The administration of the vast Roman Empire, with its complex finances and sprawling correspondence, depended on a new class of powerful bureaucrats. These were men who had risen from the lowest rungs of society to become the emperor's most trusted advisors. And they would become Messalina's most important and most dangerous allies. To understand the court of Claudius, one must understand the role of the imperial freedman. In Roman society, freedmen, or liberti, were former slaves who had been granted their freedom, but they were not entirely free. They occupied a strange social limbo. They were often highly educated and skilled, but they were forever tainted by their servile origins. They also retained a powerful bond of obligation to their former master, who became their patron. And the most powerful patron in the world was the emperor. Claudius, who had spent his entire life being mocked and underestimated by the blue-blooded aristocrats of the Senate, placed his trust not in them, but in the talented and loyal freedmen of his own household. These men owed everything to him. Their loyalty was absolute, unlike the senators, who constantly dreamed of restoring their own power. And so, Claudius built a cabinet, a professional bureaucracy, run almost entirely by these Greek-speaking former slaves. 3 of these freedmen rose to positions of almost unimaginable power, forming an inner circle that effectively ran the empire. Their names were Narcissus, Pallas, and Callistus. Narcissus held the position of Abbe Epistulus, which meant he was in charge of the emperor's correspondence. He was, for all intents and purposes, Claudius's chief of staff. Every letter that arrived for the emperor passed through his hands. Every decree, every official response that went out under the emperor's name was drafted by him. The smell of fresh ink would have constantly filled his offices as he penned the documents that governed the millions. Pallas used this position to become fabulously, obscenely wealthy himself, amassing a fortune that rivaled that of the richest men in Roman history. The third member of this triumvirate was Callistus. He served as the libellus, the secretary in charge of petitions. Any Roman citizen seeking a legal judgment, a pardon, or a special favor from the emperor had to submit a petition. And Callistus was the one who decided which of these thousands of petitions would ever reach the emperor's eyes. He was the gatekeeper of imperial justice, a position that gave him enormous power over the lives and fortunes of individuals across the empire. A fourth man, Polybius the Astudious, controlled the imperial library and research, shaping the very knowledge that the scholar emperor consumed. Together, these men were the true gears of the Claudian administration. They wielded more practical, day-to-day power than almost any senator, and the Roman aristocracy was utterly scandalized. The sight of a proud senator, a man whose ancestors had conquered the world, having to bow his head and speak in a deferential tone to a man like Callistus, a man he legally considered to be former property, was a source of profound humiliation and rage. It was an upside-down world, an affront to their every prejudice and tradition. The historian Tacitus, the ultimate voice of this resentful aristocracy, portrays their influence as a corrupt and sinister cancer on the state, a clear sign of Claudius's weak character and his inability to govern properly. Initially, Messalina and this cabinet of freedmen were natural allies. They were all, in their own way, outsiders who depended entirely on the emperor for their power. They shared a common enemy in the old nobility, and so they worked together. They consolidated Claudius's rule, rooting out his enemies and protecting his position. But according to the hostile sources, their collaboration quickly turned to corruption. They allegedly began to sell political offices to the highest bidder. Provincial governorships, military commands, even Roman citizenship itself all were said to be for sale. Favorable legal judgments could be purchased, and enemies could be condemned for a price. They were accused of accumulating vast fortunes together, turning the imperial court into a marketplace of power. This alliance, however, was purely one of convenience. For Messalina, the freedmen were useful tools against the Senate, but they were also rivals. They all vied for the most precious resource in the empire, influence over the Emperor Claudius. Their relationship was a careful dance of cooperation and competition, a web of shared interests and simmering distrust. For now they worked together. With her powerful allies in the bureaucracy and the complete devotion of her husband, the emperor, Messalina began to move against those she perceived as threats. Threats to her power, threats to her husband, and most importantly, threats to the future of her beloved son Britannicus. The empress, who had been elevated to the status of a goddess, was about to get her hands very, very dirty. The year is 42A. The year of Claudius is just over a year old. Appius Junius Silanus, a highly respected senator from an ancient family, is a man at the peak of Roman society. He is not only a powerful figure in his own right, but he is also married to Messalina's own mother, Domitia Lepida. He is the empress's stepfather, and he is about to be executed. The story of his downfall, as told by Tacitus, is a chilling masterpiece of political theater. According to the tale, one morning the freedman Narcissus burst into the emperor's bedchamber. His face was a mask of terror. He told Claudius a frightening story. He claimed that he had just had a dream, a vivid nightmare, in which he saw Silanus murdering the emperor. A few moments later, Messalina herself arrived, telling Claudius that she had, strangely, had the exact same dream. Claudius, ever suggestible and paranoid about conspiracies, was shaken. As if on cue, news arrived that Silanus was at the palace gates, an appointment that had in fact been arranged the day before. To the terrified emperor, this was proof. The dream was a divine warning. The conspiracy was real. Without a proper trial, Silanus was seized and summarily executed. A falsified letter, a whispered conspiracy, and the chilling sound of a death sentence pronounced in a closed-door meeting and a powerful man was gone. The ancient sources whisper of a different motive. They suggest that the real reason for Silenius' death was that Messalina had made sexual advances toward her handsome stepfather, and he had rejected her. In this version, his death was the revenge of a spurned and vindictive woman. We will never know the truth, but whether the motive was political calculation or personal vengeance, the result was the same. A potential rival, a man with his own powerful connections, was eliminated. He was not the last. The Empress and her allies allegedly began to systematically purge the court of anyone they deemed a threat. Another prominent victim was Julia Livilla. She was the sister of the dead Emperor Caligula, and like Messalina, she was a great-granddaughter of the divine Augustus. Her bloodline made her a natural rallying point for any opposition to Claudius. Soon, she found herself accused of a terrible crime: adultery. Her supposed partner was none other than Seneca the Younger, one of Rome's most brilliant philosophers and writers. Julia Livilla was exiled to a small, barren island, a damp and dark prison where she was later starved to death on Messalina's orders. Seneca himself was banished to the harsh island of Corsica. He would spend 8 long years in exile, a punishment he bitterly resented. His writings from this period are filled with bitterness, and it is no surprise that the Stoic philosophical tradition he belonged to would later produce some of the most damning accounts of Messalina's character. The purges continued. There was Poppaea Sabina the Elder, a beautiful and influential woman who was the mother of the future empress, also named Poppaea. Tacitus claims that Messalina's motive here was pure greed. Poppaea's lover, an ex-consul named Valerius Asiaticus, owned the magnificent gardens of Lucullus, some of the most beautiful and luxurious private gardens in Rome. Messalina, it was said, coveted them. Soon, Asiaticus was accused of treason, and Poppaea was charged with adultery. He was forced to take his own life. She was driven to suicide. Messalina got the gardens. One can imagine her walking through her new prize, feeling a cold satisfaction as she admired the statues and fountains that had been acquired through death. Accusations of sexual immorality and conspiracy became the weapons of choice. They were easy to fabricate and nearly impossible to disprove. After a prominent guest at a banquet had suddenly disappeared, a forced and fearful silence would fall over the rest of the court. The final desperate pleas of an accused senator being dragged away by guards became a familiar, if terrifying, sound on the Palatine Hill. The freedmen, especially Narcissus, were ruthless political operators. It is entirely possible, even probable, that many of these executions were carried out by Claudius and his freedmen for their own reasons, and that Messalina, after her death, became a convenient scapegoat, a way to blame all the unpopular and bloody decisions of the reign on the evil empress. The truth is likely buried somewhere in the middle. She was almost certainly a ruthless political player in a game where the only other option was to be a victim. And her primary goal was always the same: to eliminate any and all potential threats to her son, Britannicus' succession to the throne. As Messalina's political enemies fell, one by one, to accusations of treason and conspiracy, a different kind of attack against her began. This attack was more subtle, but ultimately far more damaging. It did not use the swords of the Praetorian Guard, but the poisoned words of rumor and gossip. Whispers started to circulate through the city whispers about the Empress's own morality, painting a picture not of political ruthlessness, but of insatiable, dangerous, and depraved desire. In Rome, political assassination was often preceded by character assassination. And for a powerful woman, the easiest and most effective line of attack was always sexual slander. Roman political invective was a brutal art form, and accusing an opponent's wife or daughter of promiscuity was a standard tactic designed to undermine his honor and authority. Messalina was not the first powerful woman to face this. Livia, the revered wife of Augustus, was accused by her enemies of using both poison and adultery to achieve her political goals. To the Roman patriarchal mindset, a woman who sought power in the public sphere was acting like a man. Therefore, it was assumed her sexual appetites must also be masculine, aggressive, predatory, and insatiable. This was the ultimate transgression of Roman gender norms. The stories that would come to define Messalina's legacy were written decades after her death. The two primary sources for her alleged promiscuity are the scathing annals of the historian Tacitus and the viciously satirical poems of Juvenal. Both were men of a social class that resented her power, and they were writing for an audience that was eager to believe the very worst about the Claudian era. The whispers likely began in the places where the elite men of Rome gathered, in the hushed corners of the Senate House, or amidst the steam and noise of the public baths. A salacious rumor, whispered from one senator to another, could spread through the city like a fever. Soon, crude graffiti mocking the Empress might be found scratched onto a city wall, a public and humiliating testament to the stories being told in private. These rumors created a feeling of paranoia in the court. Who was spreading these stories? Who was inventing them? A courtier sharing a juicy piece of gossip, his breath smelling of wine, could be a friend sharing information or an enemy planting a lie. The rumors served a clear political purpose. They were designed to isolate Messalina from her allies, to discredit her in the eyes of the elite, and to portray her husband Claudius as a weak, pathetic cuckold who could not even control his own wife. The more public honor she received, the larger a target she became. Every statue, every coin bearing her image, was a reminder of her unnatural prominence, and it fueled the resentment against her. One of the first stories to name a specific lover centered on a handsome and popular stage actor named Mestor. The Empress, it was said, became completely obsessed with him. Tacitus tells the story with relish. He claims that Mestor, fearing the emperor's wrath, initially refused Messalina's advances. But Messalina was not to be denied. In a move of breathtaking audacity, she supposedly went to Claudius and, without revealing her own desire, complained that the actor was refusing to obey an order she had given him. Claudius, wanting to please his wife, summoned Mestor and commanded him to obey Messalina in all things. The actor, now trapped by the emperor's own words, had no choice but to submit. The story is diabolically clever. It portrays Messalina as a manipulative tyrant who cleverly uses her husband's own authority to satisfy her lust. And it makes Claudius the ultimate fool, an emperor who personally commands his wife's lover to sleep with her. It is impossible for any modern historian to verify this story or any of the alleged affairs. We have only the hostile accounts written by her enemies, long after she was dead and unable to defend herself. These whispers were creating a narrative, brick by brick, a narrative that would make her eventual bloody downfall seem not like a political execution, but like a moral necessity, a cleansing of the state. The whispers and rumors were damaging, but they were still largely confined to the elite circles of Rome. Soon, however, the stories would escalate, growing wilder and more shocking. They would eventually culminate in a legend of epic proportions. A tale so lurid and so unforgettable that it has almost completely eclipsed the real woman and has defined her in the popular imagination for 2,000 years. The portrait of Messalina is becoming darker, painted by the brushes of her enemies. The quiet whispers would become a roar of condemnation, painting a portrait of an empress so consumed by vice that she threatened the very fabric of the empire. A portrait that would culminate in a story of public treason and a secret legend of unimaginable depravity. In the treacherous world of the Roman court, every affair was a political act, but some were more dangerous than others. Messalina's next alleged transgression would not be a secret rendezvous whispered about in the baths. It would be a public spectacle, a brazen and audacious challenge to the emperor's authority that would set her on a collision course with destiny. The man at the center of this storm was named Gaius Silius. Silius was, by all accounts, the Roman ideal of a man. He was a senator, destined for the highest office of consul in the following year. He was intelligent, well-regarded, and possessed a formidable family name. And as the historian Tacitus is careful to note, he was the most handsome man in Rome. He was also married to a respectable noblewoman, Junia Silana, a woman who was a friend of Messalina's rival, Agrippina. Silius represented everything the Roman aristocracy valued: lineage, ambition, and perfect form. And Messalina, the empress, supposedly became utterly infatuated with him. According to the ancient historians, this was no mere dalliance. Messalina's passion for Silius was all-consuming, and she pursued him with a terrifying single-mindedness. She demanded that he divorce his wife. For a Roman man of his standing, this was a serious and dishonorable act, a public repudiation of a perfectly acceptable aristocratic marriage. But the empress demanded it. Silius, caught between the danger of refusing the most powerful woman in Rome and the dishonor of obeying her, hesitated. But Messalina's will and the rewards she offered were overwhelming. He divorced Junia Silana. This was the point of no return. Unlike her other alleged affairs, which were spoken of as secret vices, this relationship was conducted out in the open for all of Rome to see. It was a performance of power. The empress's official litter, carried by her slaves, would be seen parked openly outside the private mansion of Gaius Silius. The entire city could watch as she came and went from his home, making no effort to conceal her presence. Her visits were frequent and long. The nervous glances of Silius's own household staff must have followed her every move, the servants acutely aware that they were witnessing a transgression that could bring ruin upon them all. She showered him with gifts, but these were not her own private possessions. She began to divert the wealth and property of the imperial household itself. The glint of imperial gold and the sheen of silver plate, previously seen only at the emperor's table, now adorned the dining room of Gaius Silius. Priceless furniture, works of art, and even slaves and freedmen from the palace staff were reportedly transferred to his mansion, as if he were a co-ruler. The rustle of fine silk and the scent of expensive perfumes would linger in a room long after the empress had left, a constant, fragrant reminder of her presence and her favor. For her husband, the Emperor Claudius, this was a direct and undeniable public humiliation. While he was busy with the affairs of state, his wife was openly carrying on with another man, using the emperor's own wealth to enrich her lover. The other senators would have watched this spectacle with a mixture of terror and glee. Their forced smiles and polite nods at court would have hidden a frantic speculation about how this could possibly end. This affair went far beyond a matter of personal indiscretion. It was beginning to look like a political conspiracy. Gaius Silius was a consul designate, a man on the cusp of supreme political power, and he was childless. This fact was not insignificant. In any potential plot to overthrow Claudius, Silius was an attractive partner for Messalina. He would not bring rival heirs into the equation. The throne could pass directly from Claudius to Messalina's own son, Britannicus, with Silius serving as a handsome and powerful prince consort and regent. Tacitus portrays Silius as a man fully aware of the mortal danger he was in. He knew this path led either to the throne or to the executioner's block. But he was swept up by the sheer scale of the rewards, dazzled by the prospect of absolute power, and perhaps truly captivated by the Empress herself. Their affair was no longer just a scandal. It was an act of treason taking shape in plain sight. This flagrant affair was already a shocking crisis, one that threatened the stability of the entire court. But it was another secret story that was being told in the shadows that would cement Messalina's reputation for depravity for all time. A story that pushed her beyond the realm of political ambition and into the category of a mythological monster. A story of a night spent in the lowest dregs of Roman society, a night that would give birth to the legend of the she-wolf Empress. It is one of the most shocking and infamous stories in all of ancient history. It is the tale that gives this video its name, and the legend that has defined Messalina for 2 millennia. The primary source for the story is not a mainstream historian, but a writer named Pliny the Elder, who included it as a curious anecdote in his massive encyclopedia, The Natural History. The poet Juvenal would later take this anecdote and embellish it, turning it into a lurid and unforgettable scene in his satires on Roman moral decay. The story goes like this. Messalina, the Empress of Rome, would wait until her husband, the Emperor Claudius, was sound asleep in the imperial palace. Then, consumed by a lust that the splendors of the court could not satisfy, she would sneak out. She would disguise herself, covering her noble features with a coarse woolen hood or veil, and hiding her dark hair beneath a cheap blonde wig, the customary color for Roman prostitutes. She would make her way through the dark streets of the capital to the Suburra. This was the most notorious district of Rome, a crowded, chaotic, and dangerous slum filled with taverns, gambling dens, and brothels. There, she would enter a common lupanar, a public brothel. She would take on a false name, a work name for the night. She called herself Lysiska. The name was a piece of grim poetry. It meant the she-wolf. And she-wolf was the common slang term for a prostitute, a reference to the she-wolf who had nursed the founders of Rome, Romulus and Remus, now perverted into a symbol of sordid commerce. Inside the brothel, the air would be thick with the stench of stale wine, cheap perfume, and human sweat. The dim, flickering light from oil lamps would cast long, dancing shadows on the walls, which were covered in garish, erotic frescoes. The sounds of the place would be a cacophony of rough laughter, drunken shouts, and the constant creaking of bed frames from the small stone cells where the women worked. Into this world stepped the Empress. Juvenal adds the detail that she would have her nipples gilded with gold dust. She would occupy a vacant cell, pull back her hood, and offer herself to the common sailors, gladiators, and laborers who frequented the establishment. The jarring contrast is almost unimaginable. The woman who wore imperial purple by day, who was legally considered sacred, now standing on the gritty floor of a brothel, selling her body for a few bronze coins. But the story does not end there. it builds to a climax of shocking absurdity. According to Pliny, Messalina was not content to merely participate in this world. She had to conquer it. She arranged a competition, a challenge with the brothel's most accomplished and famous prostitute, a woman named Scylla. The contest was one of endurance. The goal was to see which of them could service the most men in a single 24-hour period. The grim competition began. All through the night and into the next day, a line of men came to Messalina's cell. Pliny the Elder reports the final score with the dry, factual tone of an encyclopedist. Scylla, the professional, gave up after servicing 25 men. But Messalina, the Empress, continued. She kept going until the brothel owner forced her to stop when the establishment closed for the night. She had won. The poet Juvenal adds a final, damning detail to the story. He writes that after the contest was over, Messalina departed, exhausted by men, but still not satisfied. This was the story that served as the ultimate proof of her unnatural character. It portrayed her not merely as an adulterer, but as a creature of insatiable, pathological lust. A woman whose appetites were so monstrous that they could never be fulfilled. It was the capstone of the character assassination, a tale so extreme, so vile, that it made any action taken against her seem not just necessary, but righteous. It is a truly shocking story. It is a story that has captivated and disgusted readers for centuries. It is so shocking, in fact, that it demands we stop. It requires us to step back from the lurid narrative, take a breath, and ask the most important historical question there is. Is any of it true? When confronted with a story as extreme as Messalina's night in the brothel, a historian's first duty is to look at the sources. And when we do, the foundations of this legendary tale begin to crumble. Our most detailed historical account of Messalina's life and downfall comes from the historian Tacitus. He is no friend to her. He despises her and accuses her of countless crimes and murders. Yet, in his main narrative, this specific spectacular story is nowhere to be found. Tacitus mentions her nightly orgies in a vague sense, but the detailed account of the competition with a prostitute named Scylla does not appear. If the most sensational story about the Empress were true, it seems highly unlikely that her greatest detractor would have failed to include it. So where does the story come from? As we noted, the first mention is in Pliny the Elder's Natural History. Pliny was a brilliant and curious man, but he was not a court historian. He was an encyclopedist, a compiler of facts, trivia, and rumors about the natural world. His work is filled with amazing information, but also with tall tales and hearsay. For him, the story of the Empress's contest was a fascinating, record-breaking piece of trivia about human endurance, not a verified historical event. Our other source, the poet Juvenal, was a satirist. He was writing long after Messalina was dead, and his entire purpose was to criticize the morals of his own time by using extreme, exaggerated examples from the past. A satirist, by definition, is not a reliable source for literal historical fact. Imagine trying to write a serious political history of the 21st century using only the scripts from late-night comedy shows. That is the modern equivalent of using Juvenal as a primary source. Then there is the simple question of logistics. The emperor and empress lived in the imperial palace on the Palatine Hill. It was not a simple house. It was the nerve center of the empire, a sprawling complex guarded day and night by the elite Praetorian Guard. The idea that the Empress, one of the most recognizable people in Rome, could simply disguise herself and sneak out unnoticed travel across the city to the Suburra, spend the entire night and the next day in a brothel, and return without anyone in her vast household of slaves, attendants, and guards knowing, is logistically absurd. It stretches the limits of belief. Furthermore, the story fits perfectly into the known tropes of Roman political slander. As we have seen, accusing powerful women of extreme sexual misconduct was a common political weapon. The details seem almost engineered to be the perfect inversion of the Roman female ideal. The modest matrona was supposed to be chaste, private, and devoted to one man. This story makes Messalina promiscuous, public, and devoted to all men. Finally, we must consider the political context in which these stories were written down. After Messalina's death, her great rival, Agrippina the Younger, became Claudius's new wife. Agrippina was a master of propaganda, and she even wrote her own memoirs, which are now lost, but were a key source for later historians like Tacitus. It was in Agrippina's direct interest to have her predecessor remembered as a monster. By painting Messalina as so vile that her removal was a service to the state, Agrippina justified her own rise to power and legitimized her own son, Nero, as the new heir, supplanting Messalina's son, Britannicus. The abstract feeling of historical bias hangs over these texts like a thick fog, obscuring the truth. The quiet, scholarly atmosphere of a modern historian's office is often spent trying to peer through this fog, picking apart the ancient texts to separate plausible fact from vicious fiction. So, did Messalina compete with a prostitute in a brothel? The overwhelming consensus among modern historians is no. The story is almost certainly a fabrication, a piece of brilliant, ugly propaganda. It is more valuable to us today as evidence of how her enemies wanted her to be remembered, rather than as evidence of what she actually did. It is the ultimate slander, a lie so powerful that it has outlived the truth. Whether the brothel story was fact or fiction, the narrative of Messalina's recklessness was now firmly established in the minds of her enemies, and her open public affair with Gaius Caelius was about to escalate into a final, unbelievable act of defiance. An act so audacious that her enemies would no longer need to rely on whispered rumors. They would have undeniable proof of treason. The year is 48 Emperor Claudius has traveled the short distance from Rome to its port city of Ostia, at the mouth of the river Tiber. He is there to officiate an important public ceremony, leaving the capital under the watch of his court. While the emperor was away, Messalina made her final, fatal move. She decided to get married. The story, as told by Tacitus, is one of the most bizarre episodes in Roman history. Messalina, who is still very much married to the Emperor Claudius, held a full public wedding ceremony, and she married her lover, Gaius Caelius. This was not a secret elopement. It was a formal event, staged in the heart of Rome for all to see. A wedding procession moved through the streets, with the Empress of Rome as the bride. The ceremony was allegedly complete with all the proper legal and religious rituals. There were official witnesses to sign the contract. A dowry was presented. Sacrifices were made on the altars of the gods, the smell of the burning offerings rising into the Roman sky to sanctify this illegal and treasonous union. The guest list was a who's who of Roman society. Many prominent senators and equestrians were in attendance, their faces a mixture of celebration and terror. The sound of celebratory music was surely undercut by the nervous tension of the guests, who knew they were participating in an act of breathtaking rebellion. Historians have debated the meaning of this insane act for centuries. What could she possibly have been thinking? There are two main interpretations. The first, and most straightforward, is that this was an open and direct coup attempt. By marrying Silius, the handsome and popular consul designate, she was making him the new prince consort. The plan was likely to have the marriage legitimized, depose the aging and increasingly frail Claudius, and then rule the empire as regent for her young son, Britannicus, with Silius as her new husband and co-ruler. It was a grab for absolute power. A second, more complex interpretation suggests the event was a piece of obscure religious ritual. Some scholars have speculated that it was a form of mock marriage, designed to avert a prophecy. If an omen had predicted the death of the empress's husband, this ritual could have been intended to transfer that doom from Claudius onto a surrogate, Silius. By marrying him, she would make him the target of the prophecy, thus saving the real emperor. However, the overwhelmingly public nature of the event makes this secret ritual theory very difficult to believe. Magic and rituals were usually conducted in private, not with a full guest list and public sacrifices. The most damning piece of evidence was the marriage contract itself. Silius was made to sign the document, a legally binding act. For Messalina, this was bigamy. For Silius, it was a direct claim on the emperor's wife. It was an undeniable challenge to Claudius's authority, his honor, and his life. The feel of the stylus in Silius' hand as he signed his name must have felt like signing his own death warrant. The solemn expressions of the witnesses sealed the treasonous pact. Tacitus writes that the entire city was in a state of shock and disbelief at the sheer, almost insane audacity of the act. From a viewpoint just a few miles down the river, the Emperor Claudius remained at Ostia, completely oblivious to the political earthquake that was erupting in his capital. The news of this outrageous wedding traveled quickly. It was the moment Messalina's enemies had been waiting for. The whispers, the rumors, the accusations, they were all debatable. But this, a public marriage contract, signed and witnessed, this was the perfect, undeniable weapon they needed to finally destroy her. And the man who would wield that weapon was her former ally, the powerful freedman Narcissus. He would not hesitate to use it. The news of this outrageous event traveled quickly down the river Tiber to the port of Ostia. The Empress's enemies finally had the weapon they needed to destroy her, and they would not hesitate to use it. A public wedding to another man, while the emperor is away, seems like political suicide. What do you think was her motivation? Share your theory in the comments before we witness the dramatic fallout. The story of Messalina, which began with whispers of scandal, had now escalated into an open act of rebellion. The public wedding to Gaius Silius was not a secret that could be contained. It was a declaration, a challenge thrown down in the very heart of Rome while the emperor was away. For Messalina's enemies, the men who had watched her rise with a mixture of fear and resentment, this was the moment they had been waiting for. The empress had finally made a mistake so profound, so undeniable, that it could not be forgiven. The game of whispers was over. The endgame was about to begin. And the first move would be made by the man who knew the emperor's mind better than anyone. The news of the wedding swept through the imperial court like a firestorm. The powerful freedmen, Narcissus, Pallas, and Calestus, who had once formed a formidable political bloc with Messalina, now found themselves at a crossroads. Their alliance of convenience had fractured. They saw the rise of Gaius Silius as a direct and existential threat. A new regime under a new prince consort would have no need for Claudius's old advisors. Their power, their immense wealth, and quite possibly their lives, were all at stake. Yet they hesitated. Callistus, who had weathered the storms of Caligula's reign, argued for caution. Pallas, the master of the treasury, agreed. Their fear was rooted in a deep understanding of their emperor. Claudius was unpredictable. He was deeply infatuated with his wife. What if they went to him with this story, and he, in a moment of weakness or affection, chose to forgive her? Their fate would be sealed. Messalina would survive, and her vengeance upon the men who tried to bring her down would be swift and absolute. For them, the risk of acting seemed almost as great as the risk of doing nothing. They were paralyzed by fear. But one of them was different. Narcissus, the emperor's chief of staff, the man who controlled the flow of all information, saw the situation with a cold and brutal clarity. He knew that hesitation was a luxury he could not afford. For him, this was not a matter of risk. It was a matter of survival. He decided to act, and to act decisively. He would bypass the others and take control of the crisis himself. His plan was a masterstroke of political manipulation, designed to corner the emperor and leave him with no choice but to act. The look in his eyes must have been one of pure, cold calculation as his gambit began to unfold. He did not go to Claudius himself. That would have looked like a political attack from a rival. Instead, he sought out more subtle instruments. His gaze fell upon two of the emperor's favorite mistresses, women who had the emperor's trust and intimate access to him. Their names were Calpurnia and Cleopatra, not the famous queen of Egypt, but a courtesan in the imperial household. In a frantic, hushed conference, Narcissus laid out his plan. He instructed them on their roles. Calpurnia, he decided, would be the one to break the news. Her tears would be more powerful than his words. The scene was set at the imperial villa in Ostia, the bustling port city where Claudius was officiating his ceremony. The air was likely filled with the feeling of salt spray from the nearby sea, the sounds of a busy harbor mingling with the pomp of the imperial occasion. Into this scene of orderly ritual, chaos erupted. As instructed, the courtesan Calpurnia gained an audience with the emperor. She fell at his feet, weeping dramatically. Her performance was perfect. She cried out that Messalina was married to Gaius Silius. As the emperor sat there, stunned and confused by this outburst, Narcissus made his grand entrance. His voice was calm and measured, a stark contrast to Calpurnia's hysteria. This contrast was deliberate, designed to make him seem like the voice of reason in a world turned upside down. He gravely confirmed Calpurnia's story. He then proceeded to overwhelm the emperor with a torrent of damning information. He didn't just report the marriage. He emphasized its public nature, the witnesses, the sacrifices, the dowry. He detailed how the empress had transferred priceless imperial property, furniture, slaves, and heirlooms to the home of a private citizen. He framed every action not as a personal betrayal, but as an act of undeniable treason against the state. Then he delivered the masterstroke. He began to deliberately stoke the emperor's deepest fears. He reminded Claudius of his own path to power, how he had been found hiding behind a curtain in the chaos following the assassination of his predecessor, Caligula. The implication was clear. If an emperor could be murdered once, he could be murdered again. He painted a terrifying picture of Silius, the handsome and popular senator, marching on Rome to seize the throne. He convinced the emperor that his life was in immediate danger. This calculated maneuver was brutally effective. It bypassed Claudius's love for his wife and appealed directly to his instinct for self-preservation. It took control of his emotional reaction, steering him away from sorrow and directly into a state of panic and fury. The emperor's world, which had seemed so secure just moments before, now collapsed around him. The news struck Claudius like a thunderbolt. The bumbling, indecisive emperor, who had spent his life in libraries and had power thrust upon him, was utterly paralyzed by fear and confusion. He was lost in a fog of betrayal. And into this power vacuum, the decisive and ruthless Narcissus was all too willing to step. Sheer, unadulterated terror was Claudius's immediate reaction. The carefully constructed reality of his reign shattered into 1,000 pieces. The man who had survived the reigns of Tiberius and Caligula by being underestimated now felt the full weight of the imperial throne and the deadly peril that came with it. According to the historians, he was thrown into a state of complete panic. He began to ask the same questions over and over again. His voice, already afflicted with a stammer, now amplified by his rising panic. "Am I still emperor?" he would ask anyone who would listen. "Is Silius still a private citizen?" The questions revealed the depth of his fear. In his mind, he was already overthrown, already a dead man. The ghost of his murdered nephew Caligula loomed large. His key advisers, who were with him in Ostia, saw their emperor crumbling. They quickly rallied around him, urging a single clear course of action. They had to return to Rome. Immediately, they had to secure the loyalty of the Praetorian Guard at their camp. This was the only thing that mattered. The Praetorians were the kingmakers, and whoever controlled them controlled the city. Narcissus, the architect of this crisis, now played the part of the devoted, loyal servant, a rock of stability in a sea of chaos. He stoked the sense of urgency, insisting that every moment of delay was an invitation for Silius to consolidate his power and march on Ostia. And then he made his boldest move yet. He demanded temporary command of the Praetorian Guard for the day. It was an absolutely unprecedented request. For a freedman, a former slave, to be given command of the emperor's personal legion was unthinkable in Roman society. But in this moment of supreme crisis, with the emperor incapable of decisive thought, the request was granted. Narcissus, for one day, was effectively the military dictator of Rome. He had the full authority of the emperor's office and the swords of the Praetorians to enforce it. The journey from Ostia back to Rome, a distance of about 20 miles along the Via Ostiensis, became a ride of terror for Claudius. The imperial convoy raced towards the capital, the carriage jostling on the stone-paved road, its rough motion a perfect mirror of the emperor's chaotic and fearful thoughts. He was convinced that an ambush lay around every bend in the road, that Silius's men were waiting to strike. To ensure the emperor's panic did not subside, and to prevent him from being swayed by any other adviser who might suggest a more lenient course of action, Narcissus sat in the carriage with him. The image is a powerful one. The terrified ruler of the world, huddled in his seat, while his former slave sits beside him, coolly directing the response, whispering words of encouragement and alarm, keeping his master's terror at a fever pitch. Meanwhile, back in Rome, the object of all this panic was completely oblivious. The city was celebrating the Vinalia, the autumn festival of the grape harvest. And at the center of the festivities, in the house of Gaius Silius, were the new bride and groom. Tacitus paints a vivid scene of drunken revelry. The party was in full swing. People were treading grapes in large vats, the juice staining their feet purple. The sound of music and laughter filled the air, and in the middle of it all was the Empress Messalina. She was said to have her hair unbound and flowing, a symbol of wild abandon, dancing with a thyrsus and ivy-wreathed staff, associated with Bacchus, a god of wine and ecstasy. She was the picture of recklessness, celebrating her new union, completely unaware of the storm that was racing towards her from Ostia. This stark contrast between the terrified emperor in his carriage and the dancing empress at her party is the final element that seals her fate in the historical narrative. It portrays her as so lost in her own hedonism that she was blind to the consequences of her actions. The end, when it came, was abrupt and brutal. The scent of autumn and crushed grapes still hung in the air when the sounds of the party were pierced by a new noise. The heavy, rhythmic tramp of marching feet. The music stopped. The laughter died. And into the courtyard, filled with drunken revelers, stepped a group of grim-faced centurions, their armor glinting in the afternoon light. The sudden silence was absolute. And in that silence, you can imagine the look of dawning horror on Messalina's face as she finally, fatally understood that the game was over. The party was over. Narcissus, now in firm command of the Praetorians, began to round up the conspirators. For Messalina, the world she had so confidently controlled was shrinking by the second. Her allies were scattering, and the walls were closing in. The collapse of the conspiracy was as swift as it was total. Narcissus, armed with the emperor's authority, moved without mercy. Gaius Silius, the handsome senator who had dreamed of becoming prince consort, was the first to be arrested. He seemed to understand immediately that there was no hope. He offered no resistance. He did not beg or plead. He simply asked for a quick death. His request was granted. He was executed immediately, his ambitious dream ending in a bloody, anonymous death. Then the soldiers fanned out across the city, rounding up the other key figures from the wedding party. Senators and equestrians, who had been laughing and drinking at the festival just hours earlier, were now dragged from their homes and put to the sword. Narcissus was cleaning house, eliminating every last person who had been a party to Messalina's treason. Among them was the actor, Nestor. He pleaded for his life, arguing that he had only ever acted under compulsion, on the direct orders of the emperor himself. But in the frenzy of the purge, such fine distinctions were irrelevant. He, too, was killed. As her entire network of allies was being dismantled, Messalina found herself utterly and completely alone. Her guards, her vast retinue of slaves and attendants, the people who had followed her every command just a day before, now deserted her. The Empress of Rome was suddenly a fugitive in her own city. In her panic, she fled to a place she thought was a sanctuary, the magnificent gardens of Lucullus. This was the beautiful property she had so ruthlessly acquired from Valerius Asiaticus. Now it was to be her last refuge. The desolate sight of the Empress, her fine clothes perhaps stained with wine from the festival, running through the streets with only a few loyal followers, was a stunning depiction of her fall from grace. Even in this desperate moment, her political mind was still working. From the gardens, she drafted a plea for mercy, and she made one last, clever move. She sent her children, the young Octavia and Britannicus, to meet Claudius as he entered the city. She knew that the sight of his own children, her children, might be the one thing that could soften his heart and make him relent. The pitiful image of these two small children being led out onto the road to intercept the imperial convoy was her final gamble. But she had underestimated Narcissus. He was always one step ahead. Anticipating this exact move, he had given orders for the children to be intercepted and removed before Claudius could ever lay eyes on them. His cold efficiency was absolute. Messalina, hearing that her plan with the children had failed, made one last, desperate attempt herself, accompanied only by the Vestal Virgin Vibidia, whose sacred presence she hoped might grant her protection. She ran out onto the road to meet the carriage herself. As the imperial carriage approached, she began to cry out, her voice filled with desperation. "Hear the mother of Octavia and Britannicus," she pleaded. She was no longer appealing as an empress, but as a mother. But her cries were drowned out. Narcissus, still in the carriage beside the emperor, began to loudly list all of Messalina's crimes and lovers, his voice deliberately shouting over hers to distract and enrage the emperor. To ensure Claudius would not even look upon his wife's face, Narcissus had prepared a document, a scroll detailing all of her alleged affairs. He thrust the cold, stiff papyrus into Claudius's hands, forcing him to read the list of his own humiliations. Her path was blocked by the imposing, silent figures of the Praetorian Guard. Defeated, she could do nothing but retreat back to the quiet, sad atmosphere of the gardens to await her fate. Her last hope was extinguished. Her isolation was now complete. Her allies and lovers were dead. Her children had been taken from her. Her husband had refused to even look at her. In her final hours, only one person came to her side. It was her mother, Domitia Lepida, the woman who had largely been absent from her life, but who now returned to witness its tragic end. Claudius returned to the palace. There, Narcissus presented him with the full evidence and presided over a swift trial while Messalina was absent. The emperor's judgment, as always, was weak and indecisive. But his freedman's resolve was as hard as iron. The final order was about to be given. Inside the palace, Claudius's fury began to subside, replaced by his usual confusion and a flicker of old affection. After hearing the full case against his wife, and after drinking a good deal of wine with his dinner, his resolve faltered. He showed signs of wavering. Tacitus reports the emperor's fateful words. He did not pronounce a sentence of death. Instead, he simply ordered that the poor woman, as he called her, should be told to appear before him the next day to defend herself. For Narcissus, these words were an alarm bell. A delay was the one thing he could not permit. He knew Claudius better than anyone. A night's sleep, a morning of sober reflection, and the powerful presence of Messalina herself, pleading for her life, it would be enough. The emperor would forgive her. And if Messalina was forgiven, Narcissus would be executed. He had to act. Taking matters entirely into his own hands, he rushed from the dining hall. He told a waiting tribune and a group of centurions that the emperor had ordered the immediate execution of his wife. He was lying. He was forging a direct imperial command. But in the chaos, with the freedmen clearly in control, the soldiers did not question him. They proceeded immediately to the gardens of Lucullus. The sight of their torchlight flickering through the dark garden must have been the final confirmation of her fate. The soldiers found Messalina inside one of the garden pavilions. She was not alone. Her mother, Domitia Lepida, was with her. They found the empress on the floor, weeping, lamenting the cruel turn of her fortune. In this final moment, her mother, a true Roman aristocrat, tried to give her daughter one last gift, a dignified death. The sound of her stern voice cut through the weeping. She urged Messalina to stop crying and to take her own life with a dagger. It was better to die by her own hand, she argued, than to suffer the shame of a public executioner. But Messalina could not do it. Her courage failed her. The girl who had brazenly challenged an empire was, in the end, a terrified young woman unable to face death. She held the cold, hard dagger in her trembling hand, but could only weep. Her final, quiet sobs were the only sound in the room. Seeing her hesitation, and with no more time to waste, the tribune strode forward. There was a swift, brutal sound. The sound of a Roman sword doing its work. The Empress was dead. Her body was left on the floor for her mother to attend to. The news was brought back to the palace, where Claudius was still at his dinner. A servant informed him that Messalina was dead. The emperor showed no sign of emotion, not anger, not sadness, not relief. Nothing. He simply asked for another cup of wine and continued with his meal. The indifferent clinking of his wine cup was the only eulogy his wife would receive from him. In the days that followed, he never spoke her name again. And so, Valeria Messalina died at the age of 28, executed in a beautiful garden on the forged orders of a man who acted in her husband's name. Her enemies had won, but their victory would not be complete with just her death. To ensure their triumph was absolute, they would not only take her life, but also her name, her image, and her memory. As our historical journey ends, the past's dark whispers recede, leaving stillness. We've explored an empress's paradoxical reign, contrasting power with vulnerability and confronting human nature's uncomfortable truths. Her haunting legacy of scandal, resilience, and allure will guide our return. Her choices, both scandalous and strategic, still challenge our perceptions of morality, ambition, and power's true cost. Until then, let the past's complexities bring peaceful rest. If you're still with us, captivated by antiquity's echoes, we thank you for joining this shared voyage. May your dreams be filled with wisdom from forgotten empires and the quiet understanding that even in darkness, humanity's spirit illuminates the night. Until next time, may your own stories be filled with resilience and light.